Hello everyone and welcome to our Professional Development webinar series. Thank you for joining us for our presentation titled Simplifying the Soul, Renewing Lenten Practice with Paula Huston. For those of you who are with us for the first time, my name is Jared Dees. I'm the Digital Publishing Specialist at Ave Maria Press, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is brought to you exclusively by Ave Maria Press in partnership with the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Everyone in an audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenters using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed here. Please take a moment now to find the box for typing questions in your GoToWebinar panel and simply click the Send button at the bottom right-hand corner to send your questions to our presenter. And I will read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. I would like to note that this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you later this week via email, so please watch your inboxes. Now that we've gone through the technical information once again, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our presenter. Paula Huston, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, wrote literary fiction for more than 20 years before shifting her focus to spirituality. She taught writing and literature at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and served as a core faculty member of the California State University Consortium Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program for many years before leaving academia to write full-time. Her first nonfiction project was titled Signatures of Grace, for which she served as co-editor and contributor, and earned a starred review from Publishers Weekly. Her book, The Holy Way, was a Catholic Press Association Award winner, and the Catholic Book Club Major Selection earned a starred review from Publishers Weekly and a bronze medal from the Forward magazine for Book of the Year in Religion. Huston has also published By Way of Grace and Forgiveness, Following Jesus and Radical Loving. Kamau Benedictine Oblet, Huston is married, has 4 grown children, and lives in Central California. So Paula, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jared. It's great to be here.
I will hand over controls to you.
Okay. Let's see. Whoops. Okay. One sec, Jared. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I hit play too quickly. And so now I need to try to get the show my screen thing, and it's not working. My cursor's not going to the show my screen.
Here, I can take it back and send things back over to you.
Okay, let's try that again. Yeah, what it wants me to do is get out. Okay, let's try this.
There we go.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay. So, there we go.
Okay, all yours.
All mine. Okay. Well, thank you again for setting up this webinar, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Though there are clearly some downsides to the electronic revolution, one of the big pluses is that it allows people from all over the world to gather in one spot without having to get on a plane, and that constitutes a kind of miracle. With this in mind, I'd like to start today with a prayer. Holy Lord, thank you for this opportunity to come together and talk about Lent. The fact that we've set aside an hour for this particular discussion, right in the middle of our busy lives of ministry, means that we ourselves are longing to be closer to you. Though we know that we're sheltered in the shadow of your wings and that you are the sustainer of all that is, too often it feels like the opposite. Everything is up to us. So we get tired, discouraged, burned out. Or we get sad, knowing how quickly the years are going by and wishing we could just step out of this surging river of life for a while in order to bask in your sunlight. So please bless this gathering today. Help us to focus in, to listen well, to think deeply, and to ask the kind of questions that will foster a closer relationship with you. In the name of your Son, Jesus, who taught us to call you Abba, we pray. Amen. Since most of you are involved in parish ministry, you're in close touch with how quickly the realities of contemporary life can overwhelm spiritual longing. So many people have a sincere desire to taste and see God in their lives, but find themselves instead just rushing from one duty to another, with little time to reflect on anything but the next item on the to-do list. And unfortunately, those of us who do go into the ministry are sometimes the most rushed and overworked of all, which means we are in a double bind. People come to us for counsel because they can't figure out how to get past the obstacles of too much work, too little time, and we ourselves are often too worn out to be of much real help. I myself totally fall into this camp. Here I am, a writer of spiritual books on how to simplify your life, a retreat leader, a parish speaker, and a spiritual director. Yet I'm also a daughter, a sister of 4 siblings, a wife, a mother of 4 grown children, and a grandmother of 6 little ones under 5, 2 of whom live on our property. Besides all that, I teach in a writing program. As you can imagine, I'm a ridiculously busy person. Thus, far too often, I am living in such a spiritually arid place myself that all I can do is refer people on to others more centered than I am. And I'm continually surprised at how quickly I can land in this desert without even realizing where I am headed. It usually takes me a few months of nameless gloom, invisible to others but increasingly painful to me, before I get it. I've allowed the ongoing exigencies of life to once again derail me spiritually. What causes this kind of crisis? Too many tight deadlines, worry over money, an unraveling family relationship, a toxic work environment, or months of handling some unfolding medical event, as for example happened to me this past year. First, I became part of the hospice team for one of my best friends who died of cancer last July. Then my mom was also diagnosed with cancer, and my siblings and I did all the caregiving until she finally passed away several weeks ago. These sorts of things, deadlines, conflict, worry, buried anger, sorrow, quite easily take over the mental landscape, and pretty soon that's all we're thinking about, even when we're not consciously thinking at all. We stop taking care of ourselves spiritually. We stop nourishing ourselves. And gradually that sense of God's presence in our lives begins to flicker and dim and finally goes out entirely. God, of course, is still right where He's always been, as close as our own breath, but we can no longer feel Him or hear Him or sense that He's here with us. This is scary. For those of us in the ministry, it's particularly scary because it seems to call into question everything to which we've devoted our lives. What are we supposed to do now? If we continue on as usual, we begin to secretly feel like hypocrites. On the other side, if we're brave enough to call for help, we're putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position. Will people still trust us to do good work as ministers of God when we can't even handle our own spiritual crises? One of my sister's friends has been a hospice chaplain for many years. It's not as though he was not already familiar with the kinds of challenges that hospice employees face before he began this work. He had served in a dangerous mission field where people regularly suffered violent or poverty-related deaths, and he had an extensive training in working with the dying. Yet all it took to precipitate a major spiritual crisis in his life was the unexpected death of his own best friend, coupled with an administrative shakeup at work. Suddenly, the burnout he'd been bravely ignoring for too long came to the fore. He found he could no longer give his clients what they needed from him, and he quit. Another friend of mine, a young jail chaplain involved in gang ministry, was completely poured himself out for the young men in his spiritual community. The stories of redemption and reconciliation are astonishing. He and his new wife have even opened their home to people just coming out of prison as a kind of halfway shelter. Yet a few weeks ago, I got an email from him asking for prayer, not for the young gang members this time, but for himself. He'd hit the wall. He'd been overtaken by the darkness of despair. He could not stop crying, and he was afraid. Both of these people are dramatic examples of what happens to all serious Christians along the way, but in particular to those of us involved in various forms of ministry. A healthy spiritual life, healthy enough to weather these storms, requires commitment, daily discipline, which includes enough rest, and most of all, genuine humility, none of which our fast-paced, hyper-competitive culture encourages. In order to protect our spiritual health, we must actually learn to live against the flow, to do not what comes naturally, but what does not. The hospice chaplain is just
Paula,
now...
I'm sorry, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Some people have pointed out that we're still seeing your title screen. I don't know if your keynote has been play mode or if it's playing. We're
Oh,
not
yeah.
seeing it playing yet.
Okay, let's go back and see if we can get it started. Sorry about that.
No, I apologize. People just pointed that out.
Okay, let's try this again. Now, is it working?
No, maybe I'll take controls back over again, then send them back to you. Sorry about the
Okay.
technical difficulties, everybody. And then if you exit Keynote and then, or not exit, but just get out of play mode, and if I send it back to you, hopefully it will be better.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, there we go. It's a new slide, so.
It's a new slide. Okay.
And we can see the live screen. So if you put it in play mode now, we should be good to go.
All right, let's try that.
Okay. Sorry, everyone.
Go
ahead.
That's okay. I'll run you quickly through the other slides. There are not many of them, so here we go. That was our prayer slide. And then this is where I was telling you about my own situation, my family. That's my husband and 4 of my little grandkids. That's my mother going through her cancer process. And when I began talking about how part of the ministry, it can be scary, it's particularly scary because it involves losses. And I think, let's see, okay, this is when we were talking about ministry, reality of ministries. And this is my young jail chaplain friend with one of his guys in his program. So I think that's where you stopped me, right here.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so the hospice chaplain I was talking about is just now beginning to realize that one of the reasons he was so open to burnout was that he did not have much of a practical spiritual trellis on which to lean when the going got rough. When things got too busy at work, he let go of his daily practice and tried instead to draw on his own waning strength. More, he'd never completely committed to his work, but continued to dream about heading off to another exciting mission field. And finally, he was relying on his professional position to provide him with an identity of which he could be proud. And when the administrative shakeup threatened his job, it threw him into complete disarray. Conversely, when my jail chaplain friend hit the wall, he had more resources at his disposal, a greater level of commitment to his work, a reliable daily discipline of holy reading and prayer, and a more humble and realistic sense of himself. By putting out that cry for help the moment he needed it, he found himself lifted on wings of prayer, hundreds of people around the country coming to his rescue, and within a week, amazing things began to happen, so amazing that it was clear he was being bathed in grace. The desert can bring forth new life if we're willing to walk through it. Through commitment to vocation and a daily sustaining spiritual practice are both crucial, though they are. The secret to a healthy spiritual life is ultimately the kind of humility shown by my young friend. Scripture is filled with references to it, from the Beatitudes that open the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. To Jesus' declaration that unless we become like little children, we cannot enter the kingdom. St. Benedict devotes the longest chapters in his famous rule to this subject and considers the journey toward humility to be one and the same as the journey toward Christ-likeness. Why is humility so important? Truly humble people are grounded in reality. They neither preen under illusions of greatness nor suffer agonies of self-hatred. As Benedictine Mary Margaret Funk points out, the practice of humility is to be neither too high nor too low in our self-estimation. Like my young friend, we're able to accept the truth of who we are, weak human beings, prone to fail and tempted toward evil. yet at the same time filled with an almost unbearable longing for goodness, love, and intimacy with God. So what does all this have to do with Lent? The Lenten season has traditionally been a time set aside for introspection, compunction, which is a piercing sense of regret for sinning, and repentance. In other words, a time to assess our spiritual health, particularly in regard to humility. But that's a difficult thing to do. We get used to seeing ourselves in a certain light. We even get used to inhabiting spiritually arid terrain. Sad though it may make us, it begins to feel normal. Wouldn't it be easier to just soldier on and let things be?
Yes.
The term I've used in the title of this webinar, Simplifying the Soul, is a kind of shorthand for the process of becoming more humble, more in touch with reality, and thus more spiritually healthy. During the second part of this talk, we'll be looking at specific practices that can help. I did not invent these practices. They're adaptations of traditional Christian disciplines, particularly monastic disciplines. What I've tried to do is suit them to contemporary living. What is the point of these practices? Most of all, they're meant to wake us up to what we can't usually see about ourselves. In a sense, they're meant to shock us out of our complacent slumber. Most of them involve putting our bodies on the line in some way. This, too, comes straight out of ancient monastic wisdom. As embodied spirits, we can't ever safely ignore the physical dimensions of ourselves. And in fact, the body is an incredibly accurate barometer of what's going on with the soul. For example, if we're regularly sneaking into the kitchen in the middle of the night to eat half-gallons of cookie dough ice cream, there's a signal that there's something wrong spiritually as well as physically, something we need to face up to and address. What happens when we commit ourselves to the kinds of small physical practices I'm talking about here? Not only do we wake up to what we've been unable to see in ourselves before, but we discover what helps us versus what hurts us. We begin to figure out what our own personal obstacles are to a deep, intimate, ongoing relationship with God. Perhaps we're being blocked by a strong focus on achieving success in the world. There's some interesting practices that reveal this tendency very quickly. Perhaps we're being blocked because we've never required our body to sit still long enough to listen. Perhaps we're being distracted by too deep an interest in other people's beautiful bodies. Whatever the obstacles, they can be overcome, but only through a commitment to changing our habits of thinking and acting. The key to conversion of life, as this process has traditionally been called, is to uncover, recognize, and change the little habits that make us who we are. Not very exciting stuff, but time-tested and bedrock solid, and even at times a lot of fun. Or maybe funny is a better word for it. Once we start looking hard at our little idiosyncrasies, the secret little rewards we bestow on ourselves every day, such as that caramel macchiato at Starbucks whenever we've had a particularly stressful time of it, we start to laugh at what it is that really makes us tick. So now let's look at some practices we might think about trying out for Lent this year. Even though we've traditionally observed Lent by denying ourselves something we love, say beer, and sticking with this for the entire 6 weeks, the 40 days of Lent present a great opportunity to experiment with many different disciplines. If something works particularly well, we might think about keeping it going throughout the year. There are a lot of different ways to tackle this enterprise. The most important thing, however, is to try to keep an open, experimental attitude, even when we don't particularly like what we're doing. What we're really doing, even when something seems boring or silly, is inviting God to teach us some things about ourselves that we haven't already figured out, all for the sake of drawing closer to Him. That's a great goal. Simplifying space. It's pretty well a given that we Americans have too much stuff. We tend to buy a lot of things we don't really need. They call this impulse buying, and then when we don't use these things and don't have any room for them, instead of giving them away, we stick them in storage units, the storage business being an enormously successful enterprise in our day and age. A few years ago, National Geographic ran a photo essay on families around the world sitting in front of piles of all their earthly goods. And what we Americans have as compared to the rest of the Earth's population is downright startling. Even when we don't buy a lot of stuff, things seem to stack up, and we are way too busy to devote days to sorting through and getting rid of unused items. So once again, we put them in closets or storage units and try to forget about them. Yet somehow they weigh on us, occupying mental as well as physical space. They're ours, which means we somehow have a responsibility for them. They tie us to a particular house or place or time of life or long-gone person. They're a nagging reminder that someday someone else is going to have to sort through all these things and decide what to do with them. Thus, on day 1 of Lent this year, it could be good to start on this mess of accumulated goods by cleaning out a junk drawer. A junk drawer is the classic repository for what we are meant to leave behind. Not only does it symbolize our histories, but it also reveals the speed at which we live through them. When we clean out a junk drawer for Lent, we're in some small way dealing with the detritus of breathless hurry and our corresponding inability to focus. We're beginning to tear through the sticky web that binds us to our past. As we go through our junk drawer, we should be asking ourselves what these items represent. Many of them will no doubt qualify as genuine junk, things that were simply stuck away instead of being carried out to the trash. Others might be useful except for the fact that they're never used. These are easily bequeathed to someone else. If we come across something we cannot yet bear to part with, we should not struggle with ourselves too long. Instead, we should pack it into a box, label it, and seal it up. Then store it in an attic or the garage rafters for a few years, remembering that if we leave it there too long, someone else will have to deal with it. Meanwhile, we can pray for liberation from these ultimately ephemeral reminders of the past. Simplifying the use of money. Though we often worry about having enough money in comparison to many other people on this earth who are fabulously wealthy. Curiously enough, however, the more we have, the less clearly we see our true circumstances. For example, the plethora of food in today's supermarkets, coupled with the fact that most of us own cars, turns the daily chore of food gathering into a perfunctory task rather than an occasion for Thanksgiving. Yet all over the world, people labor in rice paddies and cornfields from sunup to sundown in order to feed their children. Given the sheer wealth of our country, we Americans are in danger of losing our sense of awe at having enough on the table each night. One way to circumvent this blasé attitude toward groceries is to suffer a little in the process of obtaining them. What does this mean? It means that one day during Lent, we could walk instead of drive to the nearest grocery store, that we could carry on our backs what we've purchased in order to feel the weight and heft of God's goodness to us. It means we could take responsibility for only one day for the transportation of food from farm to table. But we've got to be careful. Those of us who've not backpacked before may easily underestimate how much a large pack weighs. This means we must really think through what it is we actually need, which often turns out to be not that much after all. Ironically, voluntarily limiting what we buy through the practice of having to carry it on our backs actually increases our appreciation for what we have. In other words, the practice of giving something up does not lead to a sense of deprivation, but instead to a sense of joy and thanksgiving. Those who have less are often happier with what they do have. Our attitude toward money reveals a lot about our true priorities in life. Do we rely on money to make us feel secure? Do we see money as an indicator of our success or failure in life? Do we put more emphasis on making money than we do on the other aspects of our existence? Jesus said we cannot serve two gods. We cannot serve both God and mammon. Deliberately simplifying the use of money can free us up to grow closer to God. Simplifying the care of the body. In a media-dominated culture with its pantheon of movie stars, models, and celebrities, it's easy to believe that the way we look determines whether or not we get what we want out of life. Thus, many of us spend inordinate amounts of time on our appearance. We invest in personal trainers at the gym, highlight our hair, go to plastic surgeons, buy the latest fashions, and diet constantly, all in the effort to be beautiful and young-looking. Yet all we get in return is dissatisfaction, for we can never look like the media idols we worship. This emphasis on looks also determines our relationships with others, including who we choose as spouses. But everybody gets old at some point, and thus relationships built on looks are built on sandy soil. To a large degree, our high divorce rate can be directly tied to this unrealistic emphasis on being eternally attractive. More, when we devote so much time and energy to preserving a certain image, we're shorting ourselves in other important areas of life. How can we be genuinely interested in the fate of others if we're so invested in what we see in the mirror? An overemphasis on personal appearance almost inevitably leads to self-centeredness. One way to circumvent this worry over our looks is to deliberately forego a bath or shower for one day during Lent. In our culture, we're used to being squeaky clean, and with such easy access to hot water in the privacy of our own homes, it's natural to forget that for many people around the world, not to mention our own recent ancestors, hot running water is a miracle and bathing a rare luxury. As we go through the day uncomfortably aware that we're not as clean as usual, we can pray for release from habits of self-pampering and for increased awareness of other people's trying or difficult situations. On a larger scale, we can pray to be released from the cultural obsession with looks. Simplifying the mind. From TV to movies to the internet, we're surrounded by ways to distract ourselves. If we choose, we can be eternally plugged into our electronic devices. We can even develop online personalities that have nothing to do with who we really are. Our entire lives can be lived vicariously. Yet the more fantasy we imbibe, the more we require. The more mental stimulation we get used to, the less we're able to calm down, be silent, and simply listen. It's almost impossible to develop a viable relationship with God when we are so tied to the electronic version of life. We're simply far too distracted. And if humility is connected to facing ourselves squarely and realistically, then the electronic options for self-reinvention lead us in the opposite direction, toward vainglory and pride. One side effect of spending a lot of time in the electronic world is that words become cheap. We can anonymously say whatever we want to and not be stuck with the consequences. We just become part of yet another calm box rant. Yet Christian tradition says words are not only powerful, they can call things into being in the same way God called the world into being by saying, "Let there be light." Hence, the ancient practices of solitude and silence, meant to still the tongue and quiet the mind long enough for us to hear the still, small voice of God speaking. In honor of the holiness of words, one Lenten practice might be to disconnect entirely for a whole day from email, Facebook, and all other social networking sites. Instead, we can allow silence to take the place of electronic chatter for a while. And in that peaceful hiatus, we can try thinking about ourselves, other people, and God in different terms than we usually do. What will arise when we treat words with proper respect is a different kind of prayer, not dependent on what we say, but instead what we are focused upon. Simplifying the schedule. One of the ways we measure success in our culture is by how busy we are. We cannot help but think that the more we have on our calendars, the more important we must be. Status in America is strongly linked to productivity, and busyness seems to be evidence that we're working very hard. Yet busyness can quickly become mindless if we don't watch out. Instead of living reflective, thoughtful lives, we wind up living by the clock, constantly rushing to keep up with a myriad of obligations and responsibilities. The result is a chronic case of stress, and too much stress makes it difficult to see anything outside our own internal chaos. Even though we are spending every waking hour with other people, we begin to feel alienated, cut off, and isolated. In the case of our relationship with God, this is even more true. The more packed our schedules and frantic our rushing, the less we're able to focus on anything, much less the invisible spiritual realm. This is why ancient monastic practices always emphasize solitude and silence as a path to deep communion with God. We must let everything else fall away, even if only temporarily, if we're ever to connect. Yet, one of the hardest things we can do in a culture like ours is to voluntarily step out of the whirlwind. We fear being shoved aside, overlooked, left behind. The moment we opt out of the constant rush, we become suspect. Who do we think we are? One way to begin loosening the stranglehold of our schedules is to learn to welcome interruptions. A good Lenten practice is to give thanks for the person who bumbles into the middle of our packed day and ruins our plans. This unexpected visitor requires that we make a choice. Either we place our own agenda first and dodge the opportunity to interact with a fellow human being, or we set aside our plans for the sake of another. Invariably, when we choose the second option, we find that this frustrating interruption is actually important and meaningful in a way we could have never predicted. Hospitality is one of the great virtues in the Bible, and in monastic life too, because it requires that we place another before ourselves. Simplifying relationships. Though there are a number of ways we can simplify our relationships, including learning how to sit in silence with a friend, asking for forgiveness when we've done harm, and forgiving when we ourselves have been hurt, one that I've found particularly helpful for myself is to pay closer attention to the sick. Here I'm going to take the liberty of reading from a particular chapter of my book, Simplifying the Soul, in which the suggested practice for the day is visiting someone in the hospital. So this is from the book. For years, we've hosted a weekly Christian meditation session in our big red barn. The group changes and flows with the seasons. Some people like the long, warm, light-filled evenings of summer, even though at times it gets so hot that we have to adjourn to the turtle pond instead. Others prefer dark and rainy winter nights when the twinkle lights strung from the eaves and a couple of electric candles provide a dim glow against the great black outdoors. With the exception of a small and loyal core group, people have tended to come and go. One couple, however, were such regular participants that I learned to count on them if we ourselves happened to be out of town. They would arrive early, lock up the dogs, open the gate, and prepare the room for the others. Then they'd lead the meditation and close up when everyone else had left. But one day they failed to appear. Shortly thereafter, I got an email from Terry. Emily, just a few years older than me, had had a massive stroke. She'd already undergone brain surgery and been placed in a medically induced coma. When, weeks later, she was finally awakened, it became clear that she was paralyzed on one side. She couldn't yet breathe on her own and thus could not speak either. At first I was so devastated it was hard to be with her. Every time I saw her shaved head, her motionless limbs, and the tracheotomy that kept her airway open, I superimposed the image of my laughing, vibrant fellow meditator, the friend I'd come to rely on like a sister. I felt as though she'd died, but was somehow still with us in terribly altered form. After 4 months, however, her condition had become the new reality, and for the first time I really began thinking about what it must be like for her, what was happening inside as the long hours and days and weeks continued to move past. A couple of other friends and I decided to make the 3-hour drive to the rehab facility where she was now staying. Care of the sick must rank above and before all else so that they may truly be served as Christ, says the rule of St. Benedict. Let a separate room be designated for the sick, and let them be served by an attendant who is God-fearing, attentive, and concerned. Benedict also asks the abbot to be a father to the sick in an even more obvious way than he is to the rest of the community. Like the poor, the very old, and the very young, The sick represent the weakest and most vulnerable among us. As such, they can be great burdens in times of the energy and time they require. We often avoid being with them because we are loath to squander our precious limited resources on people who are sometimes too preoccupied by their own pain or disability to even notice and appreciate what we're doing. Yet the sick are wonderful reminders that we, too, are much more fragile and dependent than we like to think. One of the reasons the very sick make us uncomfortable is because they mirror in their ravaged flesh hidden weaknesses in ourselves. They're too worn out by their suffering to be productive, much less to create or generate something entirely new, or so it seems. They do not feed us in the way that being around vibrant youth and health can feed us. Instead, and perhaps much more importantly, they give us back the truth, which is that we too will come to this if death does not take us by surprise beforehand. Going to visit my sick friend was revelatory. Her hair was now an inch long, she was sitting up in a wheelchair, and she'd gotten back partial use of one arm and hand. More, she could now speak, though softly and haltingly, and only after much thought. We took turns pushing her chair through the rehab facility corridors, then out into a quiet Zen garden. There we talked with her, though not in the old way, which no longer worked. We would pat her hand or arm, then ask a question. She would ponder deeply, sometimes for several minutes. Then she would breathe out a one or two word answer. One of these responses was astounding. When I asked her what she was praying for most, I assumed she would say healing. Instead, after a very long pause, she offered enlightenment. And suddenly I saw that she was not, in these truly agonizing circumstances, simply marking time or even sliding slowly toward despair. Instead, she was waiting for what God might teach her next. So, for practice, today, visit someone in the hospital. This person does not have to be extremely ill or even someone you know. Simply make yourself available to anyone who might need a cheering word and a friendly face. Remind yourself beforehand that visits of this kind require patience. Don't try to skimp on time, even if being there makes you uncomfortable. Remember that you are no exception to the rule. We are all of us weak creatures, all of us subject to physical disability and death, all of us in need of love. There are numerous other Lenten experiments you might try this year, such as cutting up a credit card, wearing your oldest clothes for a day, cleaning out a dirty corner of the house, learning to pray the rosary, or cooking a meal from food you've had stored for so long you've forgotten all about it. The point of each is the same, however, to make you aware of your own hidden proclivities toward self-indulgence and self-centeredness. The benefits of adopting such disciplines, even if only temporarily for part of Lent, are twofold. First, they twitch back the curtain on secret sin. For example, fasting immediately reveals our hidden propensity toward gluttony. Today we would probably refer to this as binging. Shutting off the computer for a time brings us face to face with our addiction to constant stimulation. We're guaranteed to be surprised at what we learn about ourselves when we deliberately attempt to break an old habit for a day. Secondly, such disciplines give us a way to counteract life-complicating temptations. Deliberately, we do the opposite of what feels natural and desirable. And if we're able to carry through, we experience the lifting of a burden and the clearing of a horizon. Life becomes simpler, and we experience, perhaps for the first time, a measure of real self-acceptance, one of the hallmarks of humility. These small experiments not only make us aware of our weakness, however, they also reveal our deep longing for God and for goodness. They help point us back to our real purpose in life, following Jesus, and thus they can give us real joy. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a fruitful Lent this year. Thanks, Jared.
Okay, thank you, Paula, so much. I'll take controls back over to me.
Okay.
Okay, so now's the time where we can ask questions. So please find in your questions section of your GoToWebinar panel the place where you can type questions to Paula about some of the practices that she suggested during Lent. I'll feed them to you, Paula, as they come in.
Okay.
One thing that, as people are asking questions, I'm just going to go back to our conversation that we had before we started recording today. You mentioned something that the Desert Fathers did as a spiritual direction for for the new novices.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was really fascinating. Can you talk about that as people start to ask questions?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, I've been very interested in the Desert Fathers for about 20 years now because they they constitute kind of the source for the particular branch of the Benedictines that I am belong to as an oblate, called the Camaldolese, and they were sort of a revival of Desert Father spirituality that took place 1,000 years ago. And back in those days, in the Desert Father days, we're talking, say, the 4th century, there was a kind of a completely different view of what it meant to set out upon the trail of Christianity. And one of the big needs was to find a kind of spiritual master or elder who could show you the way. And so as people came and wanted to become novices, they would be connected with an elder, and one of their daily practices almost was to reveal their thoughts, all their thoughts, without any attempt to censor things or to do self-analysis of their own. They would just say what was on their mind, and the elder, in listening, would pick up all kinds of stuff that the poor novice couldn't see about himself, and then the elder would, in turn, come up with various practices that specifically addressed those particular weaknesses in that young novice. And so, for example, I believe it's in the Institutes of John Cashin, who wrote a lot about this early desert spirituality. The abbot of the monastery is warned, that one size doesn't fit all. And of course, there are many monastic rules, but unless they're tweaked to take into account the particular individual nature of whoever's standing in front of you, they're not going to be that effective. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jared.
No, I think it does. I thought that was fascinating, and I figured people would also relate to that. So we have a couple of other comments and questions coming in. First of all, a couple of compliments from people. Alejandra wanted to know if you have recording of this presentation, and yes, we are recording this presentation right now, and we'll send this out afterwards. Teresa asked if you have a Word document or some form that can be used in small groups or parish. You sent me something to share with the group tomorrow. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, actually, I sent a list of questions. I don't think I brought them up to my studio with me, so I can't read them to you out loud. Maybe you have those, Jared. But they involve a kind of step-by-step process of really focusing in on habitual behavior. And that was something that was very key to desert spirituality, was identifying these kind of patterns that we are in, and where those, what direction those patterns are taking us. Almost invariably it involves dropping one of the habits and trying to replace it with a different one. What we do every day, and their feeling was, what we do on a daily basis habitually is who we finally become. So that's a very ancient view of human nature. And so these questions that I've designed are meant to kind of lead you through the process step by step of looking at your own habitual behavior and focusing in on one that you would like to maybe tackle during Lent,
It's incredible to me because there's so many books I feel like that are coming out today saying that exact same thing as if it's a new idea, and as you said, it's a very ancient understanding. So,
Sure.
Shannon asks about what does it mean to be a Benedictine oblate?
Oh, okay, that's a good question, and everybody always asks me that. Oblate, of course, is spelled O-B-L-A-T-E, and I think one of the original versions of this word meant gift. So, and it goes back to the days way back when parents used to actually give a child to a monastery to be raised there and to ultimately become a monk or a nun or whatever. Of course, the child at some point had to decide if this is what he wants to do in life. Well, monasteries don't operate that way anymore. They don't take children. But what they do have, many of them, many orders have this, is a group of lay people who, for whatever reason, know that they will never be actual monastics, but who are very drawn to the monastic life and practices. And usually you become an oblate after you have been visiting the monastery for a while, maybe a few years, making retreats on your own, absorbing what you see around you, attending, services, because of course monasteries are in church at least 4 times every day. And if you find that your heart is leading you in that direction, becoming an oblate is you actually make a vow in front of the community. It's a very simple vow, but one part of it is to try as best you can to live in your regular lay family life by the rule of St. Benedict, which is a very practical kind of thing. And then in my particular community, there's an additional very short rule called the Brief Rule of St. Romuald, which is about contemplative prayer and about the whole business of sit in your cell as in a paradise. Put the world behind you and forget it. Wait for God to come to you like a baby chick waiting for its mother to feed it. It's a beautiful and very simple rule, but super hard to follow when you're a normal, busy human being. But it gives you a structure then, and you can always tap back into that by revisiting the monastery and connecting with the monks like I did the other day.
How did you get started in that? Did you just call the monastery up, or do monasteries have programs set up to initiate that process?
Yeah, it really depends, of course, on individual monasteries. All the communities they all have their own personalities, and they're all quite different. But in general, especially with Benedictine monasteries, a huge kind of pillar of that life is hospitality. So almost invariably, they will have a guest house of some kind. And so some of them that you can find just by going online and making your, going ahead and registering for a night or two and making your own retreat there, participating to whatever level you want. If you want to speak with a monk, usually most places will ask you to let them know ahead of time so that they can make that arrangement. Because normally you're not going to see monks just running around when you're up there. You'll see them in church, but they're usually back in the cloistered areas. So sometimes those evolve into friendships and relationships, and that's what happened with me. I was taken the first time, which was about 22 years ago, as a non-Catholic, someone who had actually been completely away from the faith for almost 20 years, taken there by a Catholic friend, and I was just absolutely totally amazed by what I saw. I had never seen anything like it. I was wowed and overwhelmed, and I was just so drawn to it. It was like coming home for me, and eventually, wound up leading to my conversion to Catholicism, and then finally taking an oblate vow. I hope that answers.
No, that doesn't. Thank you for sharing that. That's an incredible story. I'm going to draw back to some of the questions that the people are asking about Lent specifically, and also your book. So, Lorraine would like to know if you have any suggestions for a young family with children.
Yeah, you mean for practices that the whole family could follow?
Yeah, I think so. Somebody who has, either toddlers or young children, maybe school-age children even.
Yeah. I think kids are, they're so open. We live here with 2 of our little grandkids, and so they're 2 and 5. So I am immersed in the world of the toddler and the kindergartner right now, and very close to our other grandkids too. And what I've noticed about them is they're so open and so curious about the world at this age, and so up about everything. Everything is an adventure. They also are consciously mimicking almost everything that the adults in their lives are doing. They're being formed by us. So I would say you could almost design any type of discipline or practice for your particular family that would suit the family, and get the kids on board for that. Especially if it's something that you talk about every day, or there's a certain time of the day that you do this. I mean, one of the simple things would just be saying, we're not going to have, let's try to not eat any sugar for 2 days or 3 days or something like that. Let's look at the packages and see if they have sugar in them. Well, why are we doing this? Why is it important not to eat sugar for a while? Because it shows us how much we love sugar, and we nag for it and beg for it, as little kids. But, there's a lot of people in the world that never get to taste this. And it's such a beautiful, sweet thing to taste, and it's special, And so it leads toward a kind of thankfulness at the end of it. But, yeah, they're naturals for this kind of thing. I would super encourage you to just really sit down with them and come up with some practices of your own, or, the book has got a lot of them, too.
I love that. Those are great, great suggestions. I think, again, very practical for families. So hopefully, Lorraine, that answers your question. Kathy asked about your book, and she wanted to know if these processes are in the book or outlined in the book, Simplifying the Soul.
Yeah, they are. That chapter I read to you, the last one about my friend with the stroke, that's about the size of each chapter. They're just a few pages long, and then they begin with a quotation. Each chapter begins with a quotation from a Desert Father, goes into that brief meditation with a story. I mean, all of them are stories like that. And then at the end, suggested practice, and then it ends with some words from Jesus. And there's 40 of these in the book. We designed it to cover every day of that Lenten period. So, and then, I have to credit Ave Maria with being very wise about how they suggested I write this book. They did a great job of thinking it through, making it practical for people to use.
Okay, well, thank you. Do you have any last tips for Lent this year, maybe in relation to the Year of Faith? A lot of people have been asking questions about the Year of Faith in this webinar series. Can you make any connection with, I don't know, the virtue of faith before we go?
Well, I mean, I think one practice that, I think people used to, especially in going into the religious life, the professed religious life, this would be part of their practice, but not necessarily for lay people. But it would be a kind of looking over your particular day in light of what happened to you or somebody else, in light of what your faith tells you about that. Consciously reviewing some aspect of just your regular daily life. Nobody else is yours, but how does your faith aid you in interpreting a meaning there in some way or another? That might sound a little more complicated than I mean it to, but it means taking the time maybe in the evening, after dinner when things are maybe quieted down a little, the kids are in bed, just to sit maybe with a journal perhaps, and try to pull your day into a kind of scriptural context, that has something to do with your faith structure. I think that, wow, that's just a great way to open up the doors of faith. Sometimes we don't give a lot of thought to it. We just rely on it, but we don't think through what we actually believe.
Thank you, Paula. I know I've gotten a lot out of this short little presentation, and I'm getting excited for Lent to be here and to try some of these things out, and really to your challenge at the very beginning to experiment with different disciplines and just kind of see, inviting God in to change ourselves. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome, and I hope people don't take this all too heavily and seriously. There's a spirit of kind of craziness running through the Desert Fathers that's fun, and it should be a little bit fun for us too.
I love it. Well, thank you again. And like someone mentioned about the book, there is a book that is connected very closely to what Paula was sharing with us today, and she just talked about it a moment ago, called Simplifying the Soul. You can use, as always, the webinar code or coupon code on our website, webinar, and for the date today, 122, and you'll get 20% off for our website. Make sure you use that by next Tuesday when that code expires. And we'll send this out to you in an email tomorrow with the recording, but feel free to write it down and go and buy the book now if you wish. Before we sign off, I'd like to thank our partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils, once again for their partnership in this series. And if you're not familiar with their organizations, please go check out their websites. If you're not already connected to Ave Maria Press online, please connect with us on one of the social media and social networking sites, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Vimeo. And we also have one app on the Apple iTunes Store for the Stations of the Cross, and if you search for Stations of the Cross, you should be able to find us there. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and you can find all of the recordings at the webpage, avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. All of our past recordings are housed there and able to be viewed for free. And today's webinar recording will be posted there later this week. It's an excellent resource for teachers, catechists, and all people involved in parish ministry. There's a number of presentations that have gone back for a couple of years now in various areas of parish life. And finally, please mark your calendars for our next webinar. We'll be skipping a week and coming back together on Tuesday, February 5th, 2013. Author Mary DeTouris Paus will help us start the new year at a time when most of us are giving up our New Year's resolutions and just about to take up our Lenten commitments. Based on her latest book, Cravings, Paus will explore the undeniable connection between physical and spiritual nourishment. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll see you again in a couple weeks.